The article that I chose to review had to do with students' ability to not only locate reliable information, but how they also synthesize that information and use it in their papers. So the beginning of this article really dealt a lot with building the reader's knowledge of background information and previous studies that have been conducted on a similar topic. So what they found was that most libraries and librarians focus on this early assumption that we must talk to students early about how to choose resources, that we must make sure at a young age that they understand how to manipulate databases, and that they have the ability to take the information that they find and not only make sure that it comes from a reliable source, but also that they understand how to take that information and then synthesize it into their writing. So because we focus so much on students at a young age and getting them to know these skills, what ends up happening is most of what we do, most of what we teach supports those really early learners. And it's that idea of locate, retrieve, and evaluate. We're teaching basic skills, and we're helping to make sure that students know how to find that information. So some of the previously conducted research articles discussed how looking at student bibliographies and papers can be used to prove that instruction is successful, because if they have a topic and you can identify that topic and you look at the bibliography, then you'll be able to not only identify whether or not the information literacy was successful, but you can also tell if they understood how to locate reliable sources. Some studies, however, made the point that just because students know how to use information doesn't necessarily mean they will use it the right way, and that the only way to guarantee that students can synthesize that information is to make sure that teachers add rigor. And by adding rigor, then the students are forced to use what they actually know. So the article itself wanted to measure the students' ability to actually synthesize the information and relate it to their writing assignment. So most of the information that they reviewed in the beginning had to do with students' ability to simply locate information. This study dealt specifically with students' ability to synthesize that information and accurately use it to support whatever they were writing. So what they did was they tried to determine if the information literacy lessons can affect a student's ability to use that information and then draw connections. So they had two groups. They had an experimental group and they had a control group. The experimental group was the group that had specific lessons related to not only locating sources, but how to synthesize them and use them in papers. And then the control group was the one that just had the teacher explain what the assignment was and what they were looking for. So after they started to conduct their research, they had to figure out how they're going to measure students' ability to actually synthesize this information. So they decided to use two different tools. They used a rubric, which was developed so that all of the data could be measured evenly. So there was an actual way to prove, yes, they were able to do this, no, they were not able to do this. And then they also looked at the citations in order to analyze if they were connected to a topic. So there was a panel and they did two readings for all the different papers, and they had to decide whether the citations at the end actually matched the topic. So what they found was there was no synthesis in the information regardless of the information literacy. And so by that, what they concluded was just because students were able to locate information did not mean that they actually understood how to synthesize it and how to use it in a paper. And that didn't matter whether they had that information literacy lesson or not. And then the second analysis they did was to actually analyze how the students decided to use that information once they had located it, because it became clear that they were not using the data in the papers. They were not using the information they found in their papers. They were simply using it as a citation, and they were using it as a source, but they were not interweaving the ideas together. So the second analysis came through. So as the panels were going through and reading the students' papers and trying to determine if they were able to actually synthesize the information located from the reliable sources, they decided to use the checklist and the rubric. And so for the checklist, what they did was they evaluated the usefulness of the bibliographic citations. So did the cited sources actually meet the topic? And then they looked at what the measurement was. So how accurate were they? How close to the topic were they? Did they just pick articles that seemed to relate, or did they actually really relate? And then they used the two panels. So a second reader went through and they marked up the same thing. And according to the article, there was a 92% agreement between the first reader and the second reader in determining the accuracy of the bibliographic citations. So that was a very reliable way to make sure that students were using the information. For the rubric, they went through and they used it to measure students' ability to actually synthesize the sources. So could they pull ideas out and actually tie them in with the points they're making in their papers? So they ended up with 3 different columns. They have the emerging one, where they don't really make any connections. It's clear from the bibliographic records that they're able to find sources that match the topic, but they don't do a very effective job at actually weaving the ideas together. The developing stage is where they sort of start to weave the ideas in. There's at least 1 or 2 used, but again, they don't really do a thorough job of connecting the ideas, of proving that the citations actually support the topic. And then integrating is, of course, the highest level, and that's the one where the students are able to synthesize, they are able to make those connections, they are able to prove that they understand how the literature and their topic are connected. So what they ended up finding was that students are very strong after information literacy training in finding sources. The information literacy training helped almost all students in locating sources, but in regards to actually making connections, the emerging and the developing were about 50% and integrating was about 50%. So students were not as strong at integrating the information as they were at finding the information. So what this means is students are able to locate the information with information literacy training, but that basic training, that idea that we have to get them when they're young, we have to teach them how to locate information, does not translate into students understanding how to actually apply the information to their papers. And so what's relevant about this is that librarians need to focus on the follow-up. Yes, they have to know how to find the materials, but the students also need to know how to actually use the materials. And so the author pointed out that a future investigation would be completed regarding some of those synthesis questions. How do you use the information to support a topic? How do you go through and identify specific points? How do you make sure that the article that you've chosen can be integrated? And then, of course, there's the idea, does the grade matter? Will students be able to synthesize more information if they are actually graded tougher? Or is it simply they learn how to synthesize as they go through the process? So in the future, they want to look at the time that's spent on training and the lessons that are completed, and working towards this idea of beginning, intermediate, and advanced. So yes, you found information, but now how are you going to use this information, and sort of meeting the needs of all learners. And so here is my reference. I hope you enjoyed.